I can still remember the exact moment I got the call. It was just after 6 on a Friday, and I'd just gotten home from work, exhausted but finally settled into my own space. My little apartment in the city wasn't much, but it was mine, bought and paid for with my hard work. It was small but warm, and for once, I was genuinely proud of what I'd built on my own. I let the phone ring a couple of times, knowing exactly who it was just from the sound. My mother's ringtone, a default one, nothing special. She'd only call for one of two reasons: to complain about something in her life, or to tell me what Kyle had done that deserved yet another medal. But the third ring made my stomach twist. There was something urgent in it, a note of insistence that was unlike her usual disinterested calls. I picked up, bracing myself. "Hey, Mom." "Oh, thank God you answered," she said, her voice tight and rushed. "It's your brother." There it was, the inevitable opening to every conversation. I barely got a hello, but there was always, "It's your brother." I swallowed a sigh. "What about Kyle?" He's in some trouble. He needs your help." "I need your help," she said, emphasizing the "I," as though her need alone would make me drop everything. I could hear my dad muttering something in the background, his gruff voice carrying through the line, full of impatience and annoyance. My mom continued. "He made a mistake. He didn't mean to, but it's all gotten out of hand, and he's facing some serious charges." Charges. I felt a flicker of concern despite myself. What happened? Cal got involved with some people, business deals, investments, and well, they weren't exactly legitimate. Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if anyone in my empty apartment could overhear her. "It's just a misunderstanding, but it looks really bad, Lena. He's at risk of going to jail if we don't step in." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "So, what exactly are you asking me to do, Mom?" My mother hesitated, as if gauging how much she could push. "You have some savings, right? You're not struggling, at least. If you could just lend him a little, well, more than a little, really, he'd be able to settle his debt. You'd be helping keep him out of prison, Lena. Isn't that what family's for?" I was stunned into silence. It was as if the very air in my apartment thickened, turning stale and suffocating. Here I was, working myself to exhaustion every day to scrape together a life for myself, to build something from nothing, while Kyle had coasted through life with every door opened for him by our parents. And now, here they were, asking me to clean up his mess with the money I'd earned for myself. "I'm sorry," I said finally, my voice firmer than I expected. "I don't think I can do that." I could almost feel the icy silence on the other end of the line. "Lena, this is serious." "He's your brother," my mother said, her voice laced with anger now. "All those times we took care of you. All the sacrifices we made." "Sacrifices you made for Kyle, you mean?" I interrupted. I could feel my pulse quickening, an old wound starting to bleed afresh. "Mom, every spare dollar, every opportunity you had, it all went to him. I had to fight for everything on my own. This isn't the time for a pity party, Lena. We're talking about keeping your brother out of jail. Are you really so selfish you can't help your family when it counts?" Her words stung, cutting through me like a knife, and it was everything I'd felt my whole life summed up in a single sentence. Selfish. That's what they called me every time I asked for something, every time I dared to want something of my own. They couldn't see that I was just trying to survive in the shadow of their perfect sun. "Look," I said, trying to keep my tone steady, "I understand you're scared, but I've worked hard for what I have. I don't have that kind of money just lying around to bail him out." "That's exactly it, though, isn't it?" She shot back. "You're so selfish. You can't even see past your own bank account. You think you did it all on your own, but we're the ones who gave you a start. And now it's time for you to give back." I felt a surge of anger, hot and bright, coursing through me. "You mean it's time for me to give back to Kyle? To give up what I've worked for, so he doesn't have to face the consequences of his own decisions? How is that fair?" "Fair." My mother's voice was shrill now, and I could hear my father grumbling in the background. "Life isn't fair, Lena. We do what we have to do to keep the family together. And you should be grateful you even have a family willing to ask for your help." Grateful. That was the word they always threw at me. Grateful for what? for being ignored, for being treated like an afterthought, for watching Kyle take every ounce of attention and affection they had to offer. I can't do it, I said firmly, a finality in my tone that even surprised me. I won't bail him out. For a long moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then, quietly, as if it took all her strength to say it, my mother spoke again. Fine. If that's how you feel, don't expect us to be there for you when you need it. Don't expect us to care when you've got nothing left. I let out a shaky breath, the reality of her words settling like a stone in my chest. I understand. The line went dead, leaving me alone in my small apartment, staring at the phone in my hand. I felt a mixture of numbness and fury, a kind of grief that clawed at my insides, the undeniable truth that I was, and had always been, on my own. I didn't sleep that night. The conversation replayed over and over in my mind, each word cutting deeper until I couldn't tell if I was hurt or just hollow. I thought of all the sacrifices they'd asked of me over the years, sacrifices I'd made, again and again, hoping someday they might see me. But I understood now, finally and completely, that they never would. To them, I was just a means to an end, the backup plan, the fail-safe for their precious son. In the morning, I made myself a promise. I would no longer let them control my life. I would no longer bend under their demands. I'd build my life on my terms, far from their expectations and manipulations. And this time, I'd be strong enough to keep it that way. But even as I told myself I was done, I felt a pang of dread deep in my gut. A part of me knew this wouldn't be the end. They'd find a way to pull me back, and they always did. In the days following that call, I tried to push it all away, to shove the entire twisted mess of family drama into a locked box in my mind. I threw myself into work, pouring all my energy into projects, meetings, anything to avoid the gnawing ache that had settled in my chest. But the calls kept coming, relentless. My mother, my father, even some of our extended family. They all wanted me to change my mind, to see the bigger picture, as my aunt so delicately put it. Each message had the same desperate refrain: Kyle needs you. You're his sister. Be there for your family. After a week of ignoring them, I finally turned my phone off entirely. I couldn't take it anymore. The constant reminders that, in their eyes, I was nothing more than an accessory to Kyle's life, a spare part to be used when convenient. It was like I'd never really existed outside of what I could do for him. Then one evening, I came home to find my door unlocked. Panic shot through me as I stepped inside, bracing for the worst. But instead of a stranger, I found Kyle sitting on my couch, flipping through one of the books I kept on my coffee table. "What the hell are you doing here?" My voice was sharp, my hands still clenching my keys tightly. He looked up, a smirk playing on his lips. "Nice to see you too, Lena. You have no right to be here." I walked over, standing directly in front of him. "Get out." He chuckled, putting the book down like he had all the time in the world. "Relax. I just wanted to talk." Breaking into my apartment is how you ask for a conversation now. "Come on, Lena. Don't be dramatic. Mom gave me the spare key ages ago in case of emergencies." He shrugged as if it were perfectly natural for him to let himself in unannounced. "Using the key to ambush me in my own home isn't an emergency, Kyle." My patience was razor thin, every inch of me screaming for him to leave. But he just looked at me with that same smug grin, the one he'd perfected over a lifetime of getting everything he wanted. "Look, I know things got a little heated over the phone," he said, his tone casual, dismissive, "but I'm here to clear the air. I thought maybe you just needed a little nudge to see reason." "Reason?" I repeated, incredulous. "You think showing up here uninvited is going to make me want to help you?" "Family helps family," he said, leaning back like he was settling in for a long chat. "I know things haven't been fair, but that's just life, Lena. I'm your brother, and we both know you'd regret it if something happened to me because you refused to step up." That was it. I felt something snap inside me, years of resentment and anger bubbling up to the surface. Step up? Kyle, I've spent my entire life stepping up. I've given up things you can't even imagine to keep this family together, and all I've ever gotten in return is being told I'm not good enough, that I don't matter as much as you. He had the nerve to look bored, even annoyed, like my outburst was an inconvenience to him. You think you're the only one who's had it tough? He scoffed, shaking his head. You've had your little job, your little apartment. You're fine. I've got everything to lose here, Lena. Everything. And all I'm asking is that you help me out for once. For once, I repeated, laughing bitterly. You've asked for my help 1,000 times, Kyle. And every time I've been there cleaning up your messes. But this is too much. He sighed, like he was talking to a stubborn child. You're being selfish. I'm your family. We're supposed to look out for each other. No, Kai. I'm supposed to look out for you. That's how it's always been. And I'm done. I could feel the tears welling up, but I blinked them away, determined not to let him see how much his words hurt me. I don't owe you anything. His expression darkened. Fine. If that's how you want to play it, then don't blame me for what happens next. He rose from the couch, brushing past me without another word. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body tense as I watched him leave. I waited until I heard the door click shut, and then I sank onto the couch, my mind spinning. There was something in his voice, something that told me he wouldn't just let this go. A few days passed in uneasy silence. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd realized he couldn't bully me into submission. But then, strange things started happening. Small things, things I might have brushed off as coincidences if I had known Kyle's capacity for manipulation. My credit card was declined at the grocery store. Confused, I checked my account, only to find a series of massive withdrawals that I hadn't authorized. Panicked, I called the bank trying to figure out what had happened. They informed me that someone had used my information to open a new account and transfer funds without my consent. And that wasn't all. I started receiving calls from clients at work asking about some partnership I'd supposedly started with another company. Except, of course, I hadn't. Somehow, Kyle had gotten into my professional circle, spreading rumors that I was planning to jump ship to work with him. It was a calculated attack, designed to destabilize me on every front. He was taking my money, my credibility, everything I'd built, and tearing it apart piece by piece. Furious, I confronted him, calling him out in a series of voicemails, but he never answered. I went to my parents, hoping against hope that they'd finally see reason, that they'd finally see the monster they'd created. But instead, I was met with nothing but indifference and excuses. Why are you making such a big deal out of this, Lena? My mother said, her voice dripping with exasperation. It's just a few misunderstandings. You'll bounce back. You always do. Bounce back. I echoed, incredulous. Kyle is stealing from me, sabotaging my career, and you're acting like it's nothing. Oh, stop being dramatic, my father chimed in. Kyle's going through a rough time. Have a little compassion. He's your brother. Compassion. They wanted me to have compassion after all he'd done. I stared at them, barely able to comprehend the depth of their favoritism. No matter what he did, no matter how low he stooped, they'd always see him as the one worth saving, the one worth defending. And that's when it hit me. They were never going to change. I could lay out every piece of evidence, scream at the top of my lungs, beg them to understand. They'd always take a side. In their eyes, I'd always be the backup, the expendable one, the support act to Kyle's star. I walked out of their house that night, my heart heavy but my mind clear. I knew now that I had to protect myself, even if it meant severing ties with the very people who were supposed to love me. If they wouldn't stand by me, then I'd stand alone. But as I drove back to my apartment, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. When I opened it, my blood ran cold. It was a picture of my apartment building, taken from the street below, with a message that read, "I'll be seeing you around." Kyle's little threat. A reminder that he wasn't done with me, that he was willing to escalate this even further if I didn't fall back in line. I closed my phone, gripping the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing. He wanted me to be scared, to feel cornered, like I had no choice but to give in. But I was done being his pawn. I knew what I had to do. It was time to take action. Time to show him and my parents that I was stronger than they'd ever given me credit for. I just had to figure out where to start. I woke up the next morning with a fierce determination I hadn't felt in years. I was done letting Kyle walk all over me. I was done with his threats, his manipulation, his constant leeching off everything I'd worked so hard for. If he wanted a fight, he'd get one. I spent that morning gathering every document I could find: bank statements, emails, records of transactions I hadn't authorized. I combed through everything, making note of every suspicious charge, every place he'd somehow inserted himself into my financial life. By the end of it, I had a small mountain of evidence, enough to show that he'd stolen from me and tried to ruin my career. But even as I built my case, I felt a pang of doubt. I wasn't just going up against Kyle. I was going up against my whole family, against every expectation and belief I'd been raised with. For years, I'd been taught that family loyalty came before everything. That loyalty, that toxic, one sided loyalty, had been drilled into me until it felt like part of my very bones. But loyalty wasn't a blank check to be used whenever it suited them. Loyalty went both ways. And my family had never once shown it to me. That evening, just as I was starting to feel the weight of what I was planning, my phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. I opened it, and there was another picture, this time of my office building. The message read, "Don't make this harder than it has to be." A cold dread crept over me, but I forced myself to push it down. This was just another attempt to control me, to keep me in line, and I wouldn't let it work. The next day, I contacted a lawyer. I explained everything from the unauthorized transactions to the threats. The lawyer, a sharp, no nonsense woman named Claire, listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "You have a strong case," she said, "but you need to be prepared for what this will do to your relationship with your family. Once we go forward with this, it's likely they'll close ranks around your brother. If you're hoping for their support, you might not get it." I felt a pang, a flicker of that old, familiar hurt. But I reminded myself of the countless times they'd chosen Kyle over me, no matter what he'd done. I took a deep breath and nodded. "I know, but this is something I have to do." Over the next few weeks, I worked with Claire to build my case. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. Every piece of evidence we uncovered felt like a fresh betrayal, a reminder of just how deep my family's favoritism ran. And Kyle didn't make it easy. When he realized I was serious, that I was truly willing to go through with this, he started a full-blown campaign to turn everyone against me. He went to our extended family, spinning tales of how I was trying to ruin him, how I was blowing everything out of proportion just to hurt him. He framed himself as the victim, painting me as this heartless sister out for revenge. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years started messaging me, asking what had happened, some even accusing me of turning on my own family. Every time I opened my phone, it was like another knife twisting in my chest. But the worst came when my parents got involved. My mother called me one evening, her voice icy and accusatory. "How could you do this to us?" she demanded. "To you?" I repeated, stunned. "Mom, this is about Kyle. He's the one who stole from me. He's the one who—" "Stop lying, Lena," she snapped. "Kyle told us everything. He told us how you've been trying to make his life miserable, how you're trying to ruin him out of jealousy. I can't believe you'd stoop this low, dragging your own brother through the mud just because you've always been bitter he was better loved." Better loved. The word stung more than I cared to admit. "Mom, he stole from me. He's been using my accounts, sabotaging my job." "Enough," she interrupted. "We raised you better than this. You know how much we've sacrificed for you, how much we've given. And this is how you repay us? By tearing our family apart." Every word felt like a slap, each accusation laced with the same contempt I'd felt from them my whole life. They weren't angry because Kyle had hurt me. They were angry because I was finally fighting back, refusing to be the family doormat any longer. But I kept my voice steady, determined not to let her hear the pain that was bubbling up inside me. "I'm not tearing the family apart," I said, my voice cold. "I'm protecting myself. And if you can't see that, then maybe it's time I finally walk away." She scoffed. "Fine. But don't expect us to be there when you come crawling back, Lena. You've made your choice." The line went dead, and I was left alone, staring at my phone with tears in my eyes. A part of me wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, to somehow purge the ache in my chest. But I knew that wouldn't change anything. They'd made their choice, just as I'd made mine. As the legal proceedings moved forward, I kept my head down, focusing on work and on rebuilding the pieces of my life Kyle had tried to tear apart. The case was complex, and the process was slow, but every day brought a small victory, a reminder that I was stronger than they'd ever given me credit for. I felt myself growing, shedding the layers of guilt and self doubt that had weighed me down for so long. But Kyle wasn't done yet. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, I opened my email to find a message from my boss asking to see me immediately. My stomach dropped as I walked into his office, bracing myself for whatever was coming. He was holding a printed email, his expression unreadable. "Lena, do you know anything about this?" he asked, handing me the paper. It was an email, supposedly from me, claiming I was planning to leave the company, that I'd been offered a better position elsewhere. My mind raced, piecing it together. Kyle. He'd somehow managed to hack into my account, or maybe he'd impersonated me in another way. Either way, he'd managed to sabotage me at work, planting seeds of doubt about my loyalty and my future with the company. "I didn't write this," I said firmly. "This isn't for me." My boss studied me for a long moment, his expression softening. "I believe you, Lena, but you need to be careful. Whoever is doing this seems determined to hurt you." I nodded, my hands shaking. I was furious, terrified, exhausted. Every time I thought I'd made progress, Cal found a way to pull me back down. But I knew I couldn't give in. I couldn't let him destroy everything I'd worked for. When I got home that night, I called Claire, telling her about the email incident. She was calm, reassuring me that we could use this as further evidence in the case, proof of his continued harassment and attempts to ruin me. "You're doing the right thing, Lena," she said gently. "It may not feel like it now, but you're taking control of your life, and that's something no one can take away from you." Her words gave me strength, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight, that I had allies who believed in me. And with each passing day, with each new challenge, I could feel myself getting stronger, more certain in my decision to finally stand up to my family, to break free from the chains they'd wrapped around me for so long. But as the days wore on, I could sense the final confrontation looming, a storm gathering on the horizon. I knew that eventually I'd have to face them all: Kyle, my parents, everyone who had sided against me. And I knew that when that moment came, I'd have to be ready to stand tall and fight for the life I'd fought so hard to build. I just had to hold on a little longer to keep pushing forward, no matter how hard they tried to pull me back. As the weeks passed, it became harder to ignore the isolation. My family was gone. My parents hadn't spoken to me since that last icy conversation, and Kyle was apparently more determined than ever to make my life hell. Even friends I thought I could rely on started to drift away, either convinced by his lies or unwilling to be caught in the crossfire of my family drama. I had no one left but Claire and the hollow comfort of knowing I was finally standing up for myself. But the loneliness was suffocating. Every corner of my apartment seemed to echo with memories of family gatherings, of holidays and birthdays when I'd pushed down my own hurt for the sake of keeping peace, trying to pretend I was part of a family that would eventually love me the way they loved Kyle. But those memories felt like lies now, reminders of all the times I'd swallowed my pride, only to be shoved aside again and again. One night, after a long day at work, I came home to find a package waiting outside my door. It was plain and unmarked, just my name scrawled on it in thick, dark marker. I brought it inside, setting it on the counter with a strange sense of dread. I half expected it to be another taunt from Kyle, something to unnerve me. But when I opened it, I froze. Inside was a stack of old photos. Family photos. Pictures of me and Kyle as kids, our parents smiling and laughing, arms wrapped around us like we were a happy family. There was even a birthday card, one from years ago that I'd written to my mother, pouring out my love and gratitude, desperate to be seen and valued. Taped to the card was a note, written in my mother's familiar handwriting. You used to be so much kinder, Lena. Where did that girl go?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I dropped the card, letting it flutter to the ground as I stood there, my mind spinning. Was this supposed to be a reminder? A guilt trip? A twisted attempt to manipulate me into giving in? But the message was clear enough. I'd been the problem all along. I was the one who'd changed, who'd turned my back on them. I sank down onto the floor, the photos scattered around me like shards of glass. It was as if they'd collected every piece of our past, every scrap of my love for them, and used it to paint me as the villain. The weight of it all pressed down on me, suffocating, until I felt like I couldn't breathe. But as I stared at those photos, something shifted inside me. I could see it now, how I'd been conditioned to believe that loving them meant sacrificing myself. How I'd been taught that my worth was measured by how much I could give, how much I could endure for their sake. And here they were, using my own memories against me, twisting them to make me feel guilty for wanting a life of my own. I took a shaky breath, gathering up the photos and the card, and tossed them into the trash. I was done letting them control me. I'd let them go, for real this time. I was fighting for my life, my freedom, and I couldn't afford to carry their expectations anymore. The next morning, I went back to Claire with a new sense of purpose. We went over the evidence again, adding the package as proof of their continued harassment. She was supportive as always, encouraging me to hold my ground, but I could see the concern in her eyes. She knew how much this was costing me, how deeply it was cutting. "You're doing the right thing, Lena," she said softly as we wrapped up our meeting. "It may not feel like it, but you're breaking a cycle. You're building a future on your own terms, and that takes incredible strength." Her words gave me comfort, but as I left her office, I could feel the weight of what was still to come. I knew that if Kyle and my parents were willing to go this far, they wouldn't stop until they'd exhausted every tactic, every ounce of guilt they could wring out of me. The final straw came a week later. I was at work trying to focus on a project when my phone buzzed. It was an email from one of my oldest friends, Sarah. We hadn't spoken much since everything started, and I'd assumed she, like everyone else, had chosen to side with Kyle. But the subject line caught my attention immediately. "You need to know this." I opened the email, and my heart dropped as I read the message. Sarah had run into Kyle at a bar, and he'd been bragging to his friends, boasting about how he was teaching his sister a lesson. He'd apparently been telling everyone how easy it was to manipulate our parents, how he'd convinced them that I was some cold-hearted monster. He'd even hinted that he had something big planned, something that would ruin her once and for all. I felt a chill run through me. He wasn't just out to hurt me, he wanted to destroy me. And he was dragging my parents along with him, feeding them whatever story he thought would keep them in his corner. I sat there, staring at the screen, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. I knew Kyle was manipulative, but this went beyond anything I'd ever imagined. He was willing to go to any length to keep control, to make sure I stayed in my place as the expendable, invisible sister. But I was done. I was more than done. I printed out the email, adding it to the growing pile of evidence. This was all I needed. I called Claire immediately, telling her everything, every last detail of Kyle's threats, his schemes, his plans to tear my life apart. "We're moving forward," I told her, my voice steady. "I'm pressing charges. He's going to face the consequences." Claire agreed, arranging for the necessary steps to be taken, and within days, we'd filed the paperwork. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew Kyle would fight back, that he'd use every weapon he had to discredit me. But this time I was ready. I was armed with the truth, with the strength I'd found in myself after years of being trampled under his shadow. The legal process was grueling, a long stretch of paperwork, hearings, statements, and mounting tension. My parents were livid, of course. They called, left angry voicemails, demanded to know how I could do this to my own family. But I ignored them, refusing to let their words pierce the armor I'd built around myself. As the weeks turned into months, the case gained traction. The evidence was overwhelming, a solid wall of proof that Kyle had orchestrated a campaign to destroy me. And for the first time, people started to see the truth. Friends who had once believed his lies reached out, apologizing, asking how they could support me. Sarah stayed by my side, a constant source of encouragement, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this fight. Finally, the day came when Kyle was summoned to court. I sat there, watching as he was forced to face the consequences of his actions, forced to answer for every lie, every manipulation, every act of cruelty he'd inflicted on me. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the arrogance he'd worn like armor. For the first time, he couldn't hide behind our parents or his charm. He was just Kyle, exposed and vulnerable. When the verdict was delivered, a sense of relief washed over me, a feeling of freedom I hadn't known in years. He was found guilty of multiple charges: fraud, harassment, identity theft. The sentence was harsh, a direct reflection of the years of torment he'd put me through, and as he was led away, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. But the greatest victory came not from his punishment, but from the knowledge that I'd finally broken free. I'd taken back my life, reclaimed my dignity, and stood up to the people who had tried to keep me down. I knew my family would never forgive me, that they'd see this as the ultimate betrayal. But I was at peace with that. They had chosen their path, and I had chosen mine. As I walked out of the courthouse, the sun shining down on me, I felt a strange sense of calm, a certainty that I was finally where I was meant to be. I had built my life from the ground up, and now I was free to live it on my own terms, without the weight of their expectations, their demands, their manipulations. I was done with them. I was done with the lies, the guilt, the constant sacrifices. I was free, and for the first time in my life, I felt whole. The courthouse steps felt both freeing and daunting as I walked down them, the weight of the verdict heavy but liberating. Kyle was finally held accountable, and I had severed myself from a lifetime of his manipulation and my parents' enabling. I took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp air, feeling the clarity I hadn't felt before. My parents' angry, accusing faces still haunted me, but I reminded myself that this wasn't betrayal, it was survival. For once, I'd put myself first. Over the next few days, I tried to settle back into my life, to pick up the pieces and start rebuilding. Work was busier than ever, but I welcomed the distraction. I spent late nights at my desk, diving into projects, reclaiming the momentum I'd nearly lost to Kyle's sabotage. My colleagues, especially those who'd been wary of me after Kyle's rumors, began to see me in a new light. I could feel their respect returning, the quiet apologies and understanding glances as they realized the extent of what I'd been dealing with. But despite everything, there was a hole in my life, a strange, empty space where my family had been. Even though they'd never truly been there for me, the finality of it all, the knowledge that I'd likely never speak to them again, was harder to accept than I'd expected. It was like mourning something that had never really existed. I was grieving the family I'd always wanted, the love and support I'd longed for, but never received. One afternoon, while I was sifting through paperwork at my desk, my phone buzzed with a text. I glanced at the screen, surprised to see Sarah's name. We hadn't spoken much since the trial ended. I needed some space to process everything, and she had respected that. But now she was asking to meet up, and there was an urgency in her message that made me hesitate. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I agreed, needing the familiar comfort of a friend, someone who'd seen me through the worst of it. We met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, a place we used to visit back in college. She was already seated when I arrived, her expression tense. The moment I sat down, she leaned forward, her voice low. "Lena, there's something you need to know," she said, her tone serious. My heart sank. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, glancing around as if to make sure no one could overhear us. "Your parents have been talking to people, telling them you lied about everything. They're saying you manipulated the court, that you somehow set Kyle up to get revenge on him. They're painting you as this vindictive, heartless person who only cares about money." I felt a cold, familiar dread creeping up my spine, the kind I thought I'd left behind in that courtroom. "They're really going this far?" She nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I didn't want to tell you, but I thought you deserved to know. People are starting to talk, and I didn't want you to be blindsided. I clenched my hands, anger and hurt mingling in my chest. I know my parents would never forgive me, but I hadn't expected them to go out of their way to destroy what little I had left. It was as though they were determined to punish me for daring to stand up for myself, to make sure I regretted ever challenging the status quo. Thanks for telling me, I said quietly, my voice tight. She reached across the table, squeezing my hand. You don't have to go through this alone, Lena. I know it's hard, but there are people who care about you, who know the truth. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. It was comforting to have her support, but the truth was, a part of me felt utterly alone. My family had always been the one constant in my life, even if that constant had been painful and complicated. Now, I had to face the reality that they would never see me as anything more than an enemy, someone who dared to break free from their expectations. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying Sarah's words over and over in my mind. I knew I couldn't control what my parents said or did, but the thought of them turning everyone I'd ever known against me was suffocating. I had fought so hard to escape their grip, to carve out a life of my own, and now they were trying to drag me back into the shadows, to make me doubt myself all over again. I could feel myself slipping, the old guilt and shame creeping in, whispering that maybe they were right, that maybe I was the problem. But I couldn't let them win. Not this time. I'd come too far to let them pull me back down. Over the next few days, I made a decision. I would face them one last time, not to apologize or seek their approval, but to make it clear that I was done. They needed to know that I wasn't afraid of their lies, that I wasn't going to let them control my life anymore. I drove to their house on a rainy Saturday morning, my heart pounding as I pulled up to the familiar driveway. The house looked exactly the same, but it felt different now, cold, unwelcoming, like a relic of a life I'd left behind. I stood there for a moment, gathering my strength, then knocked on the door. My mother answered, her face hardening the moment she saw me. What are you doing here? She demanded, her voice dripping with disdain. I took a deep breath, meeting her gaze. I came to talk. One last time. She scoffed, crossing her arms. There's nothing left to say, Lena. You've made your choice. We're done with you. Good, I said, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. That's what I came here to say, too. I'm done with all of this, with the lies, the manipulation, the endless guilt trips. I'm done letting you and Dad control my life. Her expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, sneering at me. You think you're better than us now? You think you're so strong just because you turned your back on your family? No, Mom, I said, my voice steady. I'm strong because I finally realized I don't need you. I don't need your approval, your validation, or your constant criticism. I'm strong because I know my worth now, and I won't let you take that away from me. She looked at me, her eyes cold and unfeeling. You're making a mistake, Lena. You'll come crawling back one day, begging for forgiveness. And when that day comes, we won't be here. I smiled sadly, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. Maybe I would have once, but not anymore. I'm done chasing after people who will never see me for who I am. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there in the doorway, her face twisted with anger. I could feel her gaze burning into my back as I walked down the driveway, but I didn't look back. For the first time, I felt truly free, unburdened by their expectations, their demands, their constant need to control me. As I drove away, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I had faced them, stood up to them, and reclaimed my life on my own terms. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and deeply empowering, all at once. Over the following months, I focused on building a life that was truly mine. I poured my energy into work, into friendships that had been neglected, into hobbies and passions I'd long forgotten. Slowly, piece by piece, I rebuilt myself, stronger and more resilient than I'd ever been. There were still moments of doubt, flashes of pain when I thought about everything I'd lost. But I reminded myself that I hadn't really lost anything worth keeping. My family had never valued me, never truly loved me. I'd been fighting for a place in their lives that had never existed, and now I was finally free to create my own space, my own happiness. I surrounded myself with people who saw me, who valued me for who I was, not for what I could give them. And little by little, I learned to let go of the anger, the hurt, the deep seated need for approval that had haunted me for so long. In time, I found peace. I found joy. And most importantly, I found myself, the person I'd always been but had never been allowed to become. Standing on my own wasn't easy, but it was the most powerful thing I'd ever done. I'd broken free from the chains of my past, from a family that had never truly been mine. And now, I was free to build a future that belonged to me alone. The months after my final confrontation with my parents were a strange blend of freedom and grief. Every day felt like a new beginning, yet tinged with a faint sorrow I hadn't anticipated. It was strange to mourn the loss of people who had never truly been there for me, yet that's exactly what it felt like, a loss, but also a liberation. For the first time, my life was mine alone, without anyone's expectations pressing down on me. I poured myself into work, dedicating my time to projects that excited me, challenging myself to reach higher than I'd ever allowed myself to imagine. I began to notice a shift within me, a confidence and resilience I'd never known I had. When colleagues looked at me now, they saw a capable, decisive person, not the reserved girl who had once quietly accepted every slight, every unspoken judgment. I had become someone I was proud of. One evening, as I sat by my window watching the city lights flicker below, I realized just how far I'd come. This apartment, this city, this life, I had built it all, brick by brick, without any help from my family. It was a profound realization, and it filled me with a quiet sense of pride. I didn't need anyone else's approval, not anymore. I'd built a life worth living, on my own terms. But even with the new clarity, reminders of my family lingered in unexpected moments. At times, a familiar song on the radio would bring me back to memories of my childhood, moments that had felt so safe and warm, even if, in retrospect, they'd been illusions. There was a strange comfort in those memories, and I allowed myself to cherish them, even if they didn't represent the reality of my family's love. I was learning to accept the parts of my past that had shaped me, even if I no longer let them define me. One afternoon, I received a call from Sarah. She had been one of the few friends who had stood by me through everything, even as the rumors spread and people started to question my version of events. Now, she was my lifeline to normalcy, the steady voice that reminded me of my own strength. Lena, are you free for dinner tonight? She asked, her tone light and cheerful. There's someone I think you should meet. I laughed, feeling a sense of warmth at her gentle persistence. She had been dropping hints about setting me up for months now, convinced that I needed more than just work and friendships to fill my life. I'd resisted, hesitant to let anyone too close after everything I'd been through. But tonight, there was something different in her tone, a certainty that made me pause. Fine, I said, smiling despite myself, but only because I trust your judgment. We met at a small restaurant, tucked away on a quiet street. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, the kind of place where people came to linger over long conversations. Sarah was waiting with a man named Daniel, a friend from her workplace, and the moment he smiled, I felt my own walls start to soften. He was kind, genuine, and he listened with an attentiveness that felt refreshing and disarming all at once. Our conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on everything from work to travel to the books we loved. He was intelligent, thoughtful, and most importantly, he didn't seem to carry the same weight of judgment that I'd grown so accustomed to. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to enjoy someone's company without the nagging fear of rejection or manipulation lurking in the back of my mind. Over the next few weeks, Daniel and I grew closer, finding a quiet rhythm that felt natural and unforced. He was patient and understanding, never pushing me to share more than I was ready to. Slowly, I began to open up about my past, about the complicated and painful journey that had brought me to where I was now. He listened without judgment, his presence a balm to the scars I carried. One night, as we sat together on my couch, he turned to me, his gaze steady. "You're incredibly strong, Lena," he said quietly. "Most people would have given up or gone back, but you didn't. You chose yourself, even when it meant standing alone." His words touched something deep within me, a place I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge. I had chosen myself, and that choice had been the hardest and most rewarding decision I'd ever made. I felt a surge of gratitude, both for him and for the journey that had led me here. For the first time, I felt like I was finally becoming the person I was meant to be without anyone else's expectations holding me back. In the following months, my life began to fill with moments of joy and peace, simple yet profound in their own way. Daniel became a steady presence, a reminder of the life I was building, a life that was no longer defined by the demands of others. We traveled together, exploring places I'd only ever dreamed of, each new experience a testament to the freedom I'd fought so hard to achieve. At work, I continued to thrive, taking on new challenges that once would have intimidated me. I became known for my resilience, my ability to navigate difficult situations with a calm determination. My colleagues respected me, and my accomplishments were finally my own, no longer overshadowed by the toxic family dynamics that had once held me back. Yet, even with all the progress, there were moments of lingering pain, flashes of memories that caught me off guard. I'd occasionally hear about my family through mutual acquaintances, snippets of conversations that reminded me of the world I'd left behind. Kyle was still struggling, his life a series of stumbles and half hearted attempts to regain his footing. My parents remained steadfast in their anger, convinced that I had betrayed them. But I no longer felt the pull of their disappointment. It no longer had the power to wound me as it once had. I had built a life without them, a life filled with people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could give. I had finally broken free, and I knew, deep down, that I would never go back. One evening, as Daniel and I sat on my balcony, watching the sunset over the city, he turned to me, his gaze thoughtful. "Do you ever think about them?" he asked softly, his voice gentle. I looked out at the fading light, a bittersweet smile tugging at my lips. "Sometimes," I admitted. "I think about what could have been if things had been different. But I know now that I made the right choice. I chose myself, and that's something they could never understand." He reached over, taking my hand in his, a comforting warmth that grounded me. "You deserve this, Lena. All of it. You deserve happiness and peace." I nodded, feeling a quiet sense of acceptance settle over me. The scars of my past would always be there, reminders of the battles I'd fought and the strength I'd found within myself. But they no longer defined me. I was free to live a life on my own terms, to choose happiness, to choose love, to choose myself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city, I felt a profound sense of closure. The journey had been painful, filled with losses I could never fully replace. But I had found something more valuable than any family's approval. I had found my own worth. And as I sat there, hand in hand with someone who saw me, who valued me for exactly who I was, I knew that I was finally, irrevocably free.